Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our online lecture series organized by the Center of Buddhist Studies and sponsored by Glorious and Charity Foundation. So in this online lecture series, Professor Mario Poceski is our invited speaker, and he's joining us from Florida, USA. And Professor Mario Poceski is delivering his fifth lecture today on the subject Chan literature, evolution of distinctive genres. So I think I have already given an introduction to Professor in previous occasions. For those who are joining on this for the first time, perhaps for today's lecture. So I will briefly introduce Professor Mario Poceski. So Professor Mario Poceski is a professor of Buddhist studies and Chinese religions at the University of Florida. And he received his PhD in East Asian religions and cultures with the specialization in Buddhist studies from the University of California, Los Angeles. And he has been, in addition to his the present position as the professor of Chinese religions and Buddhist studies and Chinese religions at the University of Florida. He has been a speaker or a lecturer and fellow in various universities around the world. And he has to his name many publications, some of them are authored by him and some of them are edited by him. So if you go into our book page, web page, so you will find some of his publications are listed there. So without taking much time, I will invite Professor Mario Poceski to deliver his fifth lecture today in this series, lecture series on the story of Chan, history, literature, teachings, and practices. Professor Poceski.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for organizing everything and giving me another opportunity to share some of my research and experience in Chan studies. I hope you can see the screen I'm sharing, my PowerPoint. It's coming.
Yeah, yes, we can see. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. This is this is the fifth, as was said in the lectures series, and the lectures, as explained before, meant to be independent, standalone lectures, so people can join them as they wish, as their interest and free time and other circumstances permit, but also they fit together into a larger narrative, a larger story, the story of Chan in China. So last week I was talking about Buddhist meditation, and as more specifically the Chan school's participation in the development, in the evolution of Buddhist meditation, especially with more focus on the traditional paradigm of dividing Buddhist meditation into main categories: calmness and insight, or samatha and vipassana in Pali. And in that talk, I kind of broached also in other tradition. I spoke quite a bit about Tiantai models of tradition, some of the earlier traditions, and so on. And I will do a little bit of that today. This will be more focused on Chan itself as a distinct tradition. But a main theme of all these talks is to understand the story of Chan, but always within the context of the larger development and transformation of Buddhism in China. Because notwithstanding what popular works or Zen partisan might tell you, Chan is very much an integral part, a very important central part, but it is to be understood within the context of the development of Chinese Buddhism as a whole. For the next lecture, I'm going to talk about monasticism and the way, again, Chan school participated in the evolution of Buddhist monasticism in China, both in terms of what were some of the connections between established monastic ideals, paradigm, institutions, and also what are some of the new elements that were brought about by the emergence of Chan. As you can notice from the dates, we are going to have a short break. I'm going to California next week for some research and a big conference. So I will not be able to do the lecture kind of next week and the following week, but once I come on June 30th, we will have the next lecture, and I hope that many of you, perhaps all, and hopefully others that you might tell them or might find about it will also be able to join us. So let me start with the famous adage that many of you have already heard. This is often when you have some kind of superficial or formulaic description of Chan, how the tradition is described. So, or you can say this is a definition of Chan as a tradition. So it goes like special transmission outside of the scriptural teachings, Jiao VH1, right? And Jiao here means the specific meaning of canonical Buddhism or canonical tradition, right? And so you have this kind of dichotomy between Chan and Jiao. So you have Jiao, which in this context is, you can say, almost either all of Buddhism without Chan or certain type of more canonically-oriented, scholastic, exegetical Buddhism. All right, so special transmission outside of the scriptural teachings, which does not postulate words and letters, directly pointing to the human mind, it leads to perceiving the nature and becoming a Buddha. Jianxin Zhengfo, right? So, please forgive my accent and my pronunciation, which could be better, of Chinese. So this is kind of short but telling, right? It kind of tells you that there is Chan, there is something special, there is something distinct, which separates it from the rest of Buddhism. And then the second line, which is kind of the most relevant to today's lecture, is that it's a tradition that does not postulate, you can say, does not establish or does not rely on words and letters. Instead, and this goes back to this notion of patriarchal lineage that supposedly starts with Shakyamuni leaves the flower, smiles, and transmits the essence of enlightenment to Mahakashyapa. And then that goes from one teacher or one Chan patriarchs to another until Bodhidharma comes to China. So this line is pointing to that legend. And then what's the goal of Chan here? Is to perceive the true nature of each and every being, and by perceiving the true nature, one becomes a Buddha, because ultimately the real Buddha is to be found within the mind. So if Chan have nothing to do with words and letters, then what I'm going to talk about today. But if you look in the Buddhist canon, you find that actually there is a profusion of all kinds of texts. Of course, the Chinese Buddhist canon, there is not a single canon. There are obviously various editions of the canon, where is the modern Taisho or the Koryo edition of the Chinese Buddhist canon. We have in Heinsa Monastery in Korea preserved the woodblock print here, you can see, and so on. And of course, it's not only that we find in the Buddhist canon, but there are many other Chan texts that are outside of the canon. And Chan or Zen being a living tradition, of course, it still produces literature. I mean, if you're a well-known Chan master in China or Zen master in Japan or Son master in Korea, one of the things you are going to do, or at least your disciples will do for you, is will publish a book, right? So it kind of add new literature. So also, if you look at the digital versions of the Buddhist canon, such as the C-beta version of the canon put together in Taiwan, we find lots of Chan text. This is just a printout from my computer. So you can see here, these are all Chan texts. This is in the Taisho edition of the canon. There are many different Chan texts, and some of them, for example, which is Taisho 2016, Zongjinglu by Yan Shou, that's huge text. So some of these texts are very long. Other texts are also long. Jingde Chuangdenglu is in like 30 Chuan, 30 fascicle, very long text, and so on. And of course, actually, the Taisho canon actually have relatively few Chan texts within. I mean, you have many, but compared with, you know, the totality of Chan texts in other canons, it's a very small number. If you look behind me, those green books with golden kind of signage and title written on the I guess it will be on the left side of the screen. No, sorry, it will be on the right side of the screen where I'm pointing now. So that's the Chan section of another version of the Buddhist canon. In Chinese, is Su Zang Qing, or the extended version of the canon. So it's lots of text. And again, there are some that are also not included there, and so on. So we have this kind of profusion of texts produced by a tradition which claims that it has nothing to do with words and letters. Or to put it another word, with both speech, human speech, and if you have nothing to do with speech, of course, you have nothing to do with literature. So we have a little bit of dilemma here, a contrast. We have this assertion of non-reliance on words, and then on the other hand, we have this profuse textual production, multitude of texts. Some of those texts can be traced to the Tang Dynasty, where Chan first developed and evolved into a major tradition of Chinese Buddhism. Then you have the 5 dynasties. Also, there are some important texts during this period from 907 to 960, then 960 to 1279. You have the Sung Dynasty explosion, lots of literature. I'm going to talk about some of the texts composed during the Sung Dynasty, but that continues also in later eras. And while texts produced now by contemporary Chan masters, whether it's in China or Korea or Vietnam and whatnot, are not included typically in the canon, but you can still say that you still have an ongoing production of Chan or Zen texts. And some of those texts become important, and they're included in the various versions of the Chinese canon. I'm not going to talk much about the process of inclusion, but also inclusion means decisions about not only what to include, but also what to exclude from the canon. That's complicated. It's a big topic in the study of Chinese Buddhism, but we have an evolving transformation of the Buddhist canon, in which initially the canon have translation of Buddhist scriptures that come from the West, from Central Asia, and from what we call India today. And then you have apocryphal scriptures composed in China, various treatises, philosophical treatises by Indian masters, but then you have expansion of the canon to include works of various Chinese monks, whether it's Tiantai tradition or Huayan or Chan, Pure Land, and so on. So the Buddhist canon grows, and as Chan school becomes increasingly important, a number of its texts are included in various versions of the canon, and it kind of gives them a sense of legitimacy or a stamp of approval or orthodoxy, that, you know, this is a true teaching that is worth preserving. Unfortunately, also many texts, including many important texts, are also lost. So we don't have everything that was produced. We have references to some texts that do not exist. And of course, we can assume there were other texts that really we don't even know about. But this brings the question of this kind of boundaries between Chan and the rest of Buddhism. So in the first line of the verse I used to introduce today's topic, it says jiawai, outside of the teaching. But then when you put something in words, it becomes the teaching. So what's the distinction between Chan and the rest of Buddhism? Or what are the criteria we can apply to ascertain what text can be called a Chan text? What is Chan text exactly? Going back to the poem, or the Ataje, the four-line poem about Chan being a special transmission that points to the real nature and the attainment of Buddhahood. It's a much later, actually, Adaja, so it's really have little to do with the outlooks, teachings, ideas that circulated during the Tang Dynasty. This is later, somewhat sectarian, revisionist vision, but that's the popular vision that still pertains in many quarters as people look at Chan or Zen Buddhism. So, lots of texts, and some of those texts are in the canon, some are outside, some we can label as Chan, some not, some we wonder, is this a Chan text? And again, what exactly do we mean when we say Chan text? Well, let's look at some examples. I already kind of went through some materials from the Tang Dynasty masters, so this will probably sound a little bit familiar with those of you who attended the previous lectures. But basically, this is a sermon of Chan master. Perhaps you can recognize who the person in question is. It goes something like, this is my translation: those who seek the Dharma should not seek for anything. Jiu Fa is Ying Wu Suo Jiu, right? Outside of mind, there is no other Buddha. Outside of Buddha, there is no other mind. Not attaching to good and not rejecting evil, without reliance on either purity or defilement, one realizes that the nature of offense is empty. It cannot be found in each thought because it is without self-nature. Therefore, the three realms are mind only, and all phenomena in the universe are marked by a single Dharma. Whenever you see form, it's just seeing the mind. The mind does not exist by itself. Its existence is due to form. Whatever you're saying is just a phenomenon that is identical with principle. They're all without obstruction, and the fruit of the way to awakening is also like that. I have added at the bottom there short explanation or reference to where this comes from. So this comes from Jingde Chuandenglu. Jingde is an era during the early Song Dynasty. So it's the Chuandenglu, the record of the transmission of the Lam from the Jingde era of the Song Dynasty, right? So this text was composed in 1004. And those of you who have studied a little bit Chan will know this is a very important Chan text, and I'm going to talk about it. So since this is included in a Chan text, and perhaps you recognize. It's a sermon of a very famous Chan master. We can perhaps say this is a very good example of a Chan sermon, which included in a large text is also an example of Chan literature, right? And it seems to indicate a particular point of view. I'm not going to talk much about the content or the doctrinal outlook that is presented. I spoke, perhaps you can look at my second and our third lecture where I discuss this in much more detail. You can find them on YouTube if you miss them. So, but basically you have non-seeking, identity of mind and Buddha, transcendence of all dualities, including good and evil, pure and impure, realization of emptiness, which implies, of course, the absence of self-nature. And then you have Yogacara, influence idea of mind only, that all phenomena, the three realms of existence. That's important concept in Buddhist cosmology. Basically, all realms of existence, which are divided into three, are mind only, right? That they cannot be understood. They don't have separate existence outside of the mind, and so on. And this kind of conflict. The Chinese does not have the whole passage that is translated there. Sorry about that, but you can find it easily online or in some of my books. So basically, and then you have this principle and phenomena, important point from we usually associate with Hawaiian Buddhism and so on, and the non-obstruction, right, and so on, and the way to awakening. Okay, so let's postulate that this is a Chan sermon associated with an important monk, but let me give you another translation of the same text. And this is kind of involves a little bit more scholarly analysis and digging of the actual content of this part of the sermon. This is not the whole sermon, this is just one passage. So what at first sight, if you don't know too much, or if you don't know, well, if you don't know a lot about Chinese Buddhist literature and doctrine and canonical texts and writings and different sources, you can just take that as a face value as a sermon of a Chan master. And by now, probably many of you realize it's Matsudawi, right? This is going back to the second, was it? I think it was the second lecture in the series. But actually, the first 8 characters, Fujiu Facha, Ying Wu Suo Jiu. So those who seek the Dharma, whosoever seeks the Dharma or the truth, should not seek for anything. Right, so this kind of non-seeking, important concept we came across, we are going to come across in Chan. And then this, and then the second sentence: outside of the mind, there is no other Buddha. Outside of the Buddha, there is no other mind. So this kind of, some of this I've color-coded it. Some of them are quotations, so they are direct quotations from a canonical text, and some of them are kind of paraphrasing. You can find the idea of a text, even though maybe the wording is not exactly. So this notion of mind, that the real Buddha is to be found within the mind, that you cannot find Buddha outside of the mind. You find in the Hawaiian scripture, that's an important idea. And then the next one, not attaching to good and evil. Again, you can find again in the Hawaiian scripture, in some other scriptures as well. And the nature of offense is empty. You find, for example, the scripture of Buddha's names spoken by the Buddha. And then you have Maharatnakutta Sutra scripture. It cannot be found in each thought. And of course, it's without self-nature. You find that expression all over canonical text, or especially Mahayana text. The realms are mind only is also a quotation. You can find it in the Lankavatara, in the Hawaiian scripture, among others. And then Faju Jing is apocryphal scripture, probably. It's not, it's the same title as the Dharmapada, but it's not the same text as the Pali Dharmapada. All phenomena in the universe are marked by a single truth. So what at first sight seems to be a Chan text kind of ends being a string quotations or allusion from a range of canonical texts. Now, that can still qualify as Chan text. If you establish certain criteria that it fulfills, and also just because if everything can be traced at other texts does not mean that there's not something creative or unique, because the way those different parts, the different quotations and allusion are combined into a coherent narrative that describes certain spiritual outlook and a certain way of looking at the nature of mind and reality, and encourages certain type of contemplative practice is quite unique. So just because you have themes or elements that are culled from different sources doesn't mean that there is no creative process of arranging it. But ultimately, I mean, this brings these questions that are already raised. Is this a Chan sermon? So what do we mean when we say a text is a Chan text or a sermon is a Chan sermon? Let me give you another example. This is from the same text. This comes from fascicle 30 of Jingde Chuangdelu, if you're interested in more details. So I'm going to read this. The foundation of the Supreme Way can be traced back to one mind, to the one mind. While the foundation of the teaching about mind can be traced back to non-abiding. The essence of the non-abiding mind is none other than luminous awareness that is not obscured. Lingjia, luminous awareness, right? Nature and external characteristics are both quiescent, even as they encompass all meritorious functions, including everything inside and outside. It can be deep as well as broad. It's neither existent nor empty. It's neither born nor extinct, without an end or a beginning. This is somewhat similar to Mao Tzu's sermon, isn't it? Actually quite similar. And I don't have time to give you more examples. Actually, you can find from this particular text from the Mao Tzu's record, actually something that is very, very similar. But you can see again, why mind is evoking in Mao Tzu's sermons. Certainly non-abiding, including non-abiding mind, you find in the records of the Hongzhou school, especially in Daju's Dongwu, Rutaoyang, and the concept of luminous awareness, Lingjia, is also found in various Chan texts. The notion of quiescence, the existence of opposites, so this kind of assertion of the middle way, which neither exerts an existence nor emptiness, neither birth nor extinction, neither end or beginning, or usually this is framed as beginning and end. So you can find lots of similarities, and of course it appears in a very, very important Chan text. There's kind of little doubt. You can quibble about particular text or can quibble about definition, but Jingde Chuangdelu will be, if there is an example of archetypal or prototypical Chan text, certainly Jingde Chuangdelu will be that. But actually this passage, and I'm going to continue, give another passage from the same text, actually comes from an essay written by a very, very important monk, one of the most important philosophers in the history of Chinese Buddhism, Zheng Guan. Zheng Guan is usually recognized as the fourth patriarch of the Huayan school. Now, this kind of labels of patriarch, like whether it's Chan patriarch or Huayan patriarch or Tiantai Zheyi as Tiantai patriarch, were created retroactively. So during his lifetime, he didn't think of himself as a Huayan patriarch, but certainly he was a very, very important Huayan exeget. He wrote very important, very voluminous commentaries on the Huayan scripture. I think over there, just below the red, you can see there. It's a very, very big volume of it, which includes his commentary and sub-commentaries in 3 books over there. So, so really, he you can say whatever you want, but if you put Huayan in certain category or associated with a certain school, it's going to be Huayan, not Chan. So what is a text, an essay by a famous Huayan patriarch doing in an important Chan record? What does it tell us about these categories of Chan and Huayan? And what does it tell us about the basic question that are raised? What is a Chan text? Let me continue with the passage, because I think the passage itself is quite interesting and quite nice. By the way, I've been working on this text, and actually I was writing a paper. I'm going to be presenting this paper at a conference in California in a couple of weeks, less, about 2 weeks. And I just finished yesterday actually writing the paper. I sent it, and hopefully after the conference it will be published eventually somewhere. So this is just an extra, but this is, like, you can say it's not even fresh off the press, but fresh off my computer. So kind of it continues. Chan Yao, this is an essay on the essentials of mind by Chen Quan. It is each mind then that becomes Buddha, and there is not a single mind that is not the Buddha mind. You can find almost the same thing with Baijiang, with Matsu, and so on, but certainly Huang Po, some of Chan masters. Perfect awakening is everywhere, and there is not a single speck of dust that is not a Buddha land. Therefore, when it comes to distinctions such as truth and falsehood, external objects and the self, when you bring one, they all follow. Mind, Buddha, and living beings. They're fully amalgamated and implicate each other, or to put it another way, they cannot be separated from each other. You find it in the Huayan Jing, you find it in various Chan records, including the record of Matsu. You find it in Chen Quan's essay. So, that being the case, things maybe are not as simple as the original poem I quoted to start the talk seems to implicate. Chan apparently, Chan monks or Chan writers apparently have lots of things to say, and they rely on words and letters. Maybe they sometimes might say, we rely on words and letters to transcend words and letters and point to truth and reality and so on, but nonetheless, we have lots of texts. So this brings back to this kind of larger issue of the identity of Chan and the rest of Buddhism. And this is one of the major themes I really want to explore, and I want you to think about throughout the whole series. So on one extreme, we have some kind of research. This is more Western academia kind of outlook that really, especially during the Tang, early on, there was no real Chan tradition. It was invented. The Sung, and that kind of really completely off mark, kind of inaccurate, problematic assertions that still hold on sway in some parts of the Western academia. So that's kind of obviously problematic. There was something that people refer to as Chan, and they consider themselves part of this tradition, but what exactly did they mean? How is it defined? What kind of identity was it? I mean, that's kind of complicated, but certainly there was something there. And also, how is this Chan tradition, which certainly there was awareness of from quite early on, actually, certainly by the 8th century. What was the relationship between it and the rest of Buddhism? And certainly it was not that of separation. It was not something that a radical paradigm shift or Chan being disjoint. As we can see from this text, the relationship was much more close and much more nuanced and much more complicated. So keeping in mind that kind of issue, the issue of related Chan to the rest of Chinese Buddhism at the time, then when we look at Chan literature, broadly defined, what are the criteria we can use to establish something as a Chan text? Well, there are several, like I highlight here. The first one is the provenance or the origin of the text, the author or the authorship. So how the text came to be created, by whom, for what reason, and so on. Second criteria could be the content or the teaching expressed in the text. So what are some of the ideas that are discussed? What's the general philosophical outlook presented into it? What its mapping of the path, with its attitudes towards Buddhist practice, the goals of practice, the elements of practice or the lack of elements, if you go to unstructured, no sudden enlightenment paradigm, and so on. And of course, all of these are, in a sense, problematic. For example, in terms of the content, I raised this issue, right, within the Chan sermon of a Chan master such as Matsu. You have lots of scriptural quotations, and then, but also there's a similarity between a Chan sermon and an essay written by a famous monk who is primarily associated with the Hawaiian tradition, right? But certainly you can say there are certain teachings, certain outlooks that maybe we can identify as Chan. The other one is the narrative structure or the genre, which appears in the subtitle of the lecture for today. So, how is the text structured in terms of its literary structure, in terms of its literary qualities? And I'm going to talk about genre more. There's also the issue of traditional designations. For example, was the text recognized by the tradition as a Chan text? So perhaps if the tradition said this is a Chan text, perhaps we can accept it as such. But then also, Chan literature is not uniform, as I'm going to explain soon. So there are different types of text, right? You have kongans, you have poems, you have sermons, and so on. So how do we distinguish also not just Chan literature vis-a-vis other types of both canonical and extra-canonical literature in Chinese Buddhism, but also if you kind of establish more or less what's the Chan canon, then how do we distinguish about different types of text? What are the criteria? And that was the dilemma that was faced by the editors of the Zen no Gorokyo series, the records of saying of Zen or Chan. So this is a series that was just came. It started in the 60s, I think. And just came the final volumes just came out in print recently. So this is the final version, 20 volumes actually in 22 books. And this is my project. This was one of my projects for the summer, though probably I won't be able to get because I have three other publications to finish before I can get to it. But after they published it, a journal asked me to write an article both about the series, but also about the Gorok or the Yulu genre. It's something I've written, so kind of, but I still need time to put it together. So I've been looking at this. So if you look at this, I mean, I hope you can read the titles. They are kind of, my screens are a little bit screwed up. So no, I can't do it. So if you look at the titles, you can find all kinds of Chan texts. First, the genesis and the development of this series is kind of very interesting, and I hope to interview some scholars in Japan to find out more. But you can see some things that you already recognize. So you have Liu Tzu Dangqing, the scripture of the sixth patriarch. You have the records of Matsu, which are not part of actually the original series. It was published independently. I have the book there that was published independently, but then kind of they included it in the series later on. They decided. So you have Linchi, of course, Linchi Lu. You have the Zhongmi's treatise. You have Huang Po's records here, some early texts. Discovered from Dung Huang. Then you have Xuan Sha for some reason. Han Shan poetry, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Han Shan's poems, which technically speaking don't really belong to Chan, because Huang was not, Han Shan was not really Chan master. I mean, there's a resonance. He shares similar ideas with some Chan monks, but he didn't identify himself, or during his period, he was not identified as a member of the school, but for whatever reason that's included. So here you can see all these kind of questionable choices you make, and then you have the letters of Da Hui and Woman Guan, of course. And one of the common themes here you will see, which is also mentioned, this is just this is announced in a recent volume that was sent to me. So it kind of explains, it's supported by some kind of Rinzai association in Japan. So here you can see a very sectarian outlook. This is basically, all these texts are important from the perspective, some are from the scholarly perspective of the study of Chan, especially the earlier ones, and this goes back to the pioneering work of scholars such as Yanagida Seizan, but the others are obviously sectarian Rinzai or Lynch school in Chinese, in Japan. So you have Matsu, you have Linchi, you have Huang Po, you have Dahui, kind of. So the choice is based on really the sectarian attitudes or proclivities or biases or assumptions or pieties of the people who create the series. And that's usually the case throughout the history. I mean, when you will create something, even if you try to look at the history, you start from your own assumptions, from your own agendas. I'm not saying you should start, but that's how people usually operate, for better or worse. Also, when we talk about Chan text, we have traditional texts that have been transmitted over generations, included in the canon, and then disseminated over the centuries. But also another important development in the study of Chan Buddhism in China was the discovery of various manuscripts in Dunhuang, in the cave library. So here you have a photo of Stein discovering this. This was the abbot, the Taoist abbot, who actually discovered the cave library. Kind of, when I was a graduate student, I was reading about this, and it sounds like, so it says, usually it's referred to as a cave library with Buddhist manuscripts. There are many manuscripts. It was mostly Buddhist library, but there are also other manuscripts. So probably those of you who do Dunhuang studies will be familiar with the full range of documents, including secular documents, also other religious documents that are non-Buddhist, and so on. And then a few years back, I was in Dunhuang. I was for some special program, some kind of supported international conference study tour with other scholars, and we had a special access granted by the director of the Dunhuang Institute. So I was actually able to see the cave, and I was completely, you have this kind of expectations, some kind of wonderful library, and when it's not really a library, it's just a hole in the wall. They just stashed those manuscripts and just cemented it, and that's how it was preserved, because they closed it, but it was really, really small at the kind of the corner of one of the caves. Anyway, so this was important discovery of all sorts of texts about Buddhism and also beyond Buddhism, and included also some manuscripts that contained various Chan texts. So this is an example of one of them. I haven't been using Dunhuang manuscript myself much, because most of the Chan texts from Dunhuang are earlier records of earlier tradition. My specialty is like Hongchen school, so it's kind of late 8th, especially 9th century, and then maybe going into the 10th century. But this is one text that actually pertains to this particular period and tradition I specialize in. It's Guishan Jingce, or Guishan's admonitions. I'm going to talk about it next lecture a little bit when I speak about monastic ideals, because that's the topic of this particular text. It's a very interesting but also very unique text. It was composed around 850. This is so this 9th century. This is a 10th century manuscript which was done by hand. And as a matter of fact, you have Guishan's text here. This is 1, 2, and then it continues, and then at some point it's too small. I cannot see exactly where it continues with without any breakage. Continues into a poem by another monk. This is Xin Xingming. I'm actually going to talk about it later on. So what do you have is basically somebody was just copying probably. Maybe it was also a personal manuscript, but it's preserved there, and we can look. This is a text that actually was preserved in other collections, so we knew, and but we knew about the existence of the text. The text was there. There are some commentaries of the text. The text is widely used in monastic education and so on. But this is an example of an early Chan manuscript from Dunhuang. So this brings us to the issue of Chan genres. So first of all, for those of you who, for those of us actually, who do not have much expertise in literary criticism or literary studies, let us remind ourselves what a genre is, and more specifically what literary genre is, because a genre is a general term. You have also, it can be applied for other artistic objects, films, for example. Romantic comedy will be a genre of movies or something like that, or action movies or whatever. So in terms of genre, as a term that's applied to literature, you can say it's a category or a type of literary composition which is characterized by certain common characteristics or similarities in terms of form, in terms of style, in terms of content, and maybe some other characteristics and so on. So basically, you have certain literary properties that are codified. So you have certain forms, certain, and then when text belongs to particular genres, that also brings certain expectations in terms of how you read, right? For example, if it's some kind of fantasy novel, you're not going to use common understanding of cause and effect, and or if it's something about supernatural events or ghosts or something like that, you're going to suspend your belief. You're not going to read that as if you are reading, a biography of a historical person or something like that, right? So the kind of knowing the genre also predisposes the readers to bring certain horizons of expectations, so bring certain rules or procedures of how you should read and to interpret text. So I have, in terms of my study of Chan literature, I have looked at various texts, and it's kind of complicated, obviously, in terms of how you construct these categories, but I'm going to introduce the 4 main genres. If you look at Chan literature, especially post-Tang, you can, or from late Sung and on, there are more perhaps, but these are the 4 main ones. So the first one is the records of saying, which I already mentioned, right? In terms of the Zen no Goroku series from Japan. So and here I have some examples. For example, the record of Linchi Yulu will be an example. This appears in the Zen no Goroku series. It was one of the volumes here. You have also Pang Jushe Yulu, the record of the sayings of Layman Pang. Layman Pang was a famous lay disciple of Matsu. I'm going to talk about him later on again. so usually texts belonging to these genres, to this particular genre, have yulu at the end. Though not always, because if you look at the evolution of the genre, some of the early texts actually, for example, Tanqing, Liu Zi Tanqing, the platform scripture of the sixth patriarch, kind of is a prototype. It's not exactly a yulu text, but you can say shares many of the characteristics, and it's maybe important point in the development of the genre, because it includes similar type of content and structure. But at the same time, it's not identified because the term actually appears, the label of yulu appears later on, and so there's complex evolution to that. Then we have the transmission of the lamp, Chronicles, the transmission of the lamp, Chuandeng, or transmission of the flame, goes back to the metaphor of the transmission of Buddha's enlightenment from one patriarch to another, right? So it's kind of, it's a lamp, it's a light, you can say, is transmitted from one monk to another. And then if you put that in the context of the Chan mythology about patriarchal transmission in India, so you have the 28 Indian patriarchs who transmit the living flame of the Buddha's enlightenment, comes to Bodhidharma, and Bodhidharma brings it to China. So this is the operating principle, and these texts are kind of structured as genealogical narrative. So if you look at, for example, like texts like this is a modern version of Jingde Zhuang de Lui, Sixu Chuan, but if you're really good at it, you can pretty much know this basically the yulu, it's the chronicle of the transmission of the lamp, but basically biographical entries of important Chan masters, but it's arranged in a genealogical structure. So this is like similar to secular genealogies that were popular in China at the time. So basically you have Shakyamuni, the 28 patriarchs, Bodhidharma, Huika, Sengtan, Chinese patriarch Huineng, Huairang, Matsu, and so on. So if you know, for example, the text, so you know the in Chuan 1 will be Shakyamuni. So I'm doing Matsu, so I know Matsu is Chuan 6. So at the beginning, and then his disciples will be after him, and because he is the most famous master and he has the largest number of disciples, which Fasika 6, 7, 8 will be all disciples of Matsu, and then you have disciples of Matsu's disciples. So then you know Huangpo you can find after that, and then Linchi will be after that, and so on. So you can kind of really look. So you can say this kind of genealogical model, this kind of notion of lineage, and you have probably seen this lineage chart, is embedded in the structure of the text itself. Earlier text prototype of this genre is Zudangqi, or the Whole of Patriarch collection, which I don't have a modern version copy next to me, probably somewhere there at the back, but I'm going to show you some. Actually, it appeared in the first slide for today's lecture, kind of part of the text from the original manuscript, printout of the original woodblock print from Korea. So this was similar, kind of, you can see this is important point in the evolution of the genre. Then this is an example of a yulu, or record of saying text. This is the record of Da Hui. I mentioned him when I was talking about the Kanghua model of Chan practice. So he was a very important Sung Dynasty master. And this is a wonderful book which contains the record of Da Hui preserved in DC, Washington, our nation's capital, in the Chinese rare book collection of the Library of Congress. So you can see it's quite nicely put together. Then the two other main genres that I would like to introduce briefly are the Chan monastic codes, or the so-called rules of purity, or pure rules, Jingui, and the Gonggang collections, which I already mentioned before in my previous lectures. I'm going to talk about the Chan monastic codes in more detail when I talk about monasticism. So That will be next lecture. So these are just a couple of examples. And I also mentioned them in my third lecture when I was talking about Baijiang. The Gong'an collections, I'm also going to talk about it in much more detail when I talk about the story of Nanchuan killing the cat, which is a very famous Gong'an or koan featured in these collections. So we can leave that for later, but just to be aware, it's a very different, unique, very distinctive type of Chan literature. But of course, as you study Chan, whether it's history or doctrine or institutions, of course, you cannot just restrict or shouldn't just restrict yourself to sources compiled in some of the main genres. There are other relevant sources that do not fit neatly into any of these genres. So, for example, in early Chan, and this is before the development of the distinct Chan genres, you have various, you can say, essays or treatises that follow a kind of more standard form of a treatise, Lun in Chinese, right? So, for example, I already quoted from Xiu Xin Ya Lun, Treatise on the Essentials of Mental Cultivation by Hongren, usually recognized as the fifth Chan patriarchs in China. So this is about meditation practice, the cultivation of mind. And then the text that I mentioned from Guishan Jingzi, it's also a unique text. It's kind of like a series of exhortations about monastic life, both critiques of improper conduct by monks, so kind of criticism of derelict monks or monastics who do not follow the precepts and the rules and do not uphold the highest ideals of Buddhism, and more specifically Chan Buddhism. But also, he also speaks about models of exemplary monkhood. So he says, I've noticed these terrible things various monks are doing, and this is really not the way you should go about your monastic vocation. But also, if you look at our tradition, we have these hallowed ideals of exemplary monkhood. So let me tell you a little bit about it, and let me tell you why, for a variety of reasons, including the production of bad karma. It's not good to be a monk and not to follow the precepts and take your vocation seriously, and why monasticism provides wonderful foundation for the development of compassion, of wisdom, of cultivating oneself spiritually, and ultimately reaching the highest goals of Buddhist spirituality. So, and then there are still other texts that really do not fit into the genres, but these are kind of a little bit later texts. Prime examples are Zhongmi's writings. There is this preface on a collection of Chan literature, which we don't know if it was ever compiled by Zhongmi. So this was done, I believe, in the 830s. This is an important text because he provides a lot of information about the different Chan teachings and lineages and so on, and also correlates that with the different traditions of Buddhist philosophy. And also you have certain other texts that belong to completely different genre that contains information about Chan. For example, in the case of Zhongmi, he's supposedly writing a commentary on the scripture of Great Enlightenment, Yuan Jie Jing, which is apocryphal scripture, which for some reason he thought he really liked a lot, and he wrote quite a bit about it. And but within this commentary of the scripture, there is quite a bit of information about Chan Buddhism, including information about contemporary teachers and teachings and traditions and so on. And also there's quite a bit about Zhongmi himself. He likes to write about himself also, and his importance in terms of reconciling all these divisions and creating this kind of mapping of the Buddhist world and bringing wisdom and order to the world of Chinese Buddhism. Similarly, Yang Shuo also mentioned Zongqing Li. in my fourth slide today. Oh, yeah, fourth slide. So this is a very, very long text. So I don't think you can put it in the category of Chan, even though Yensho often is described as a Chan master, but there's lots of quotation from all kinds of canonical sources, also lots of quotations and commentaries on passages from Chan texts. But this is kind of an example of a work that really is kind of voluminous summary of Buddhist doctrine and includes lots of materials, including quite a bit of materials about Chan. Another important source of information about Chan teachings are various poems compiled by Chan masters. So I have the titles of several of these. The first two are actually quite early. Xin Xingming is perhaps the most famous poem associated with Chinese, have been translated many times in English, also in other languages. Is widely quoted. Is ascribed to Sengzang, the third Chinese Chan patriarch, though probably that's mistaken. And the whole status of the poem as a Chan text is debatable because it kind of have a very general survey of Buddhist philosophical outlooks and notions about practice and spiritual cultivation that were current in China at the time. Yongjia was a disciple of Huineng, so this is also a very important text. You can find also modern commentaries on this particular text, including one by a Chan teacher in Florida, actually, who I know very well. He's a very nice person and a friend. Also, other monks, for example, another famous one, especially in Soto Zen circles, is this poem by, actually, it's one of two poems ascribed to Shetou. He was a contemporary of Matsu, and he was progenitor of what became Caotung school and then Soto school in Japan, which is why people with Soto Zen affiliation kind of want to study and reflect on this poem. The calligraphy here you have of Yongjia's is just partial. It's not the whole poem. It's just the beginning. It's by Han Shan. He was an important Ming Dynasty Chan master. So this is kind of an example. So the texts are not just the ideas, but also, I mean, it intersects with other artistic traditions, in this case, calligraphy. So, okay, I mentioned Fate in Mind, and I'm going to talk about Chan poetry a little bit more later on. But why wait? Why don't we just read a little bit of this? Just to add a personal note, when I was young, when I was a young monk, as I mentioned, I became a monk when I was novice 18 and then fully ordained when I was 20. Living in a monastery, so this was a text I really loved, and I actually recited it, read it every day for a number of years. And then now I realized when I was preparing this, I wanted to include it in the lecture. I realized I haven't read it now for many years, kind of. But I still remember many of the phrases, so I guess I'm not going senile. Still, my memory is functioning. So this is from the very beginning of the poem. It's quite a long poem, and maybe I might again bring some elements of it when we talk about Chan poetry. But it goes something like that. This is a translation I was just kind of created as I was preparing this lecture. So. It's kind of draft and rough. The other translation you can consult. Some of them you might like better, but this is my take on it. So it goes like, the ultimate way is not difficult, Wunan. Just avoid picking and choosing. If only there is no hate or love, then there is clear understanding. When there is even the smallest difference, however, heaven and earth become set apart. If you want it to manifest in front of you, do not follow or oppose anything. The conflict between what one opposes and favors is a sickness of the mind. When the profound meaning is not understood, it's futile to try to calm the mind. The last line, alternative translation. So the last two character, Nianqing, is kind of peace of mind or calm mind, right? So that your thoughts are calm, the thinking process becomes calm and serene. Too loud, so it's it's in vain trying to calm the mind. That's how I read, but you can say another reading is that when the profound meaning is understood, the peace of mind is disturbed to no avail for no reason, right? So kind of you can pick either one you like. The Chinese is ambiguous. All right, so that was my sidebar, and I think this might be a good point to do our customary 2-minute break. So we are going to stop because, again, my apologies, I cannot go on for 2 hours without stopping. I need to refill my water and kind of stand up. So 2 minutes to be continued. So thank you. Okay, I suppose the 2 minutes are up, and I hope you welcome the break rather than harboring ill or feelings towards me for making you wait. So, but if it's inconvenient, I apologize, and thank you for your patience. Let's continue, but let me add, as you listen to this, some of you might be students of Chan and have lots of experience of reading Chan texts and might know many of the texts I'm talking about, maybe have read and reflected on them. For some of you, this might be something that is new and maybe even confusing with all these different titles and names and so on. And of course, there is the potential of a language barrier because probably many of the people who are listening to this are not coming from UK, America, or some English-speaking country. So, I mean, we have to deal with these kind of limitations, but I will say, I mean, if you want the details, they are there, and of course you can go deeper, but I hope also I'm able to convey some of the basic themes or larger issues and kind of connect the dots in terms of these larger historical trajectories and development where they pertain to doctrine or literature and so on. So even if some of the texts and names and details might be a little bit obscure and familiar, maybe difficult to connect at this early stage of a study of Chan, to have a more general sense of the tradition, and hopefully also encouragement or invitation or maybe inspiration to read more, to come to more lectures. And again, the more you read this, the more you follow these lectures in the series, I think this should be becoming clearer and more easier to follow, especially if you're not familiar. And also, if you have some questions, again, to encourage you, you can bring them into the chat function in Zoom. All right. I'm not sure how it works with the live streaming in YouTube, but we have wonderful stuff here that maybe Ben can also help with that. All right. Also, and these are kind of the sources that I was talking about before, the texts that belong to various genres, and also other sources that are associated with Chan monks or monks who write about Chan. but do not belong to the genres, they can still we can more or less most of them fit them into this kind of broad rubric of Chan literature. But there are also different types of sources or different types of writings constructed in specific genres that are not readily associated with the Chan school. So let me briefly introduce some of them. The first are still the inscriptions. There was a tradition in China when a person dies to have a commemorative inscription which provides biographical information about their life, important events, accomplishments, and so on, celebrates their life, brings testimony about the legacy, influence, and so on. So you have a variety. So this will be usually famous literati, somebody who is well known for his literary skill, but also usually somebody who is prominent, maybe, or maybe young but kind of promising to become prominent within the social and political system of China at the time. So they will be asked to write this inscription after the monk dies. So usually the monk dies, and this is kind of like an epitaph. And then that will be inscribed on a stone, and calligraphy sometimes will be done also by a famous calligrapher. So this is a wonderful example from the 9th century. It was inscription by Zongmi, actually, the monk that I mentioned several times already today. When did, I think Zongmi dies in 842, if I remember correctly. I'm kind of 93% sure, I might be off by a year or two. So Pei Xiu was important scholar official in the Tang Dynasty. Actually, he rose to the rank of prime minister at some point in his very successful political career. But he was also a very devout Buddhist. And for those of us who study Chan, especially during the 9th century, his life intersects with the life of many prominent monks, including Zongmi, also Huangpo. He is actually the one who records the sermons and the dialogues with Huangpo, which we have today, or at least most of them. So this is a still inscription that he composes for Zongmi. Guifeng is the place. Dinghui is the honorific title that Zongmi got from the emperor, so that's how he refers to them. Then there is also lots of information about Chan Buddhism in Tang poetry, the poems of famous poets. These are like the best poets in the Chinese history wrote about Chan Buddhism. Bo Chu is one example, and I'm going to talk about him more when I talk about Chan poetry and literati. Du Fu also, there have been more recently some research on him and Buddhism, including his involvement with Chan Buddhism. Wang Wei, of course, is also well known for his involvement with Chan Buddhism and so on. And also there are some Buddhist genres that are not specifically associated or do not originate with the Chan tradition, such as the biographies of eminent monks, Gao's and Chuan, which contain lots of biographical entries for famous Chan monks. The most helpful in that respect is Song Gao's and Chuan, so the Song version of the biographies of eminent monks. So this was composed at the beginning of the Song dynasty in 988 by a very prominent Chan historian, Zhang Ning. He was also kind of involved in political circles at the Song court and very well connected. And one of the important features of this text is that it contains biographical entries for many important Chan masters, including pretty much all the monks that I mentioned so far in the lecture series. But they are put together alongside biographical entries for many, many other monks. So you can say this is a pan-Buddhist genre, which includes lots of information about Chan masters as well. So let me give you an example of still inscription. So what was it like? So this is a particular genre. You find still inscription for Chan monks, for other Buddhist monks, for Taoist masters, and so on. So kind of this is, so the conventions of the genres are not peculiar to the Chan school, but in this case, the subject matter is a Chan master, so this is related to Chan. So the author of Matsu's still inscription was Chuan Deyu. He was also very famous intellectual, bureaucrat, politician in the Tang Dynasty. Also rose to the stature of prime minister, and so he composed this in 791. So he was relatively early on in his career. This was 3 years after Matsu's passing away, and this is just some of the earlier parts. The inscription is a little bit longer. So the basic idea of the inscription is to provide an overview of the lives and accomplishments and the legacy of an important person. So he starts. So the religious name or Fa-Wei, or usually be referred to as Fa-Ming, right? Dharma name was Dao Yi. For generations, his family has resided in Deyang. This is a place in what is now Sichuan province. So Matsu was from Sichuan. And then he goes on to describe the circumstances of his early life. At birth, he had an exceptional appearance. So Matsu was unlike most kids. He was exceptional from the very, very beginning. And this is a common trope you find in this kind of biographical treatments where the future, there are signs of future greatness already in childhood, right? So as a young child, he did not amuse himself with playthings. I'm not sure what exactly playthings kids in Sichuan had around 7/10. But I guess in a modern parlance, you can say he was not one of those dumb kids who was just glued to a video game console or just watch too much cartoons or anything like that. He would have none of that. He stood as lofty as a mountain and was translucent as the clear water of a river. You find these tropes of loftiness of mountain and the clarity of the water of a pond or a river, kind of in other contexts, both secular literature, but also in terms of Chan text. His tongue was especially broad and long, so that it could cover his nose, while the markings of his feet were arranged in a manner that formed characters. Like, what is this? Why is he saying that his tongue was so long that it would cover his nose? I cannot do it. My long is too short, and probably so is yours. Well, actually, here he's connecting Matsu to the Buddha. So this is a reference to canonical literature, because in canonical text, various biographies of the Buddha, scriptures, and so on, you have this notion of unique marks of a Buddha, that the physical marks that are unique to the Buddha, which separates them from other people. And one of them is he have exceptionally long tongue, and the other one is that he have this character, almost like Dharma wheels, marks on the feet. So here, basically, he's comparing, like he's saying, he was very exceptional as a child, and already in birth, he was destined for greatness, and that was marked on his body itself. His complete virtue and superior spiritual ability were something that was bestowed on him from heaven. So this is a very traditional Chinese way of thinking, kind of also quite formulaic. He considered the ancient 9 schools of thought and the 6 Confucian classics, which was standard fare for education of kind of a little upper class young Chinese men. But he became concerned about their inadequacy. See, if you look at the Confucian classic he studied, as was expected by his culture, by his family, his upbringing, but he found them inadequate. Inadequate for what? He realized that they are just tools for dealing with circumstances that pertain to the managing of this world. Of what use are they as method to facilitate transcendence of the mundane world? And here you have this kind of dichotomy between Confucianism as external way that deals with managing the world, running governments, bureaucracies, maybe providing some kind of sense of public morality, and the Buddhist path that leads to transcendence, that is the inner path of uncovering true meaning, manifesting the kind of virtues that are associated with the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas and so on. It's a path that leads to transcendence of the world, while Confucianism is just merely concerned with managing or organizing the world. And then he asserts the superiority of the Buddhist path. And of course, this is from a Buddhist perspective, being written in a inscription for an important monk. The right awakening of the Buddhist approach to liberation alone is the realm where the mind of those with supreme wisdom dwell. So those who really have, who reach this kind of point of transcendence in the world through wisdom, they abide in this realm that is the province, unique province of the Buddhist religion. So here you can see even in this kind of short passage that they're later on, but you can see these kind of ideas, kind of the very traditional kind of literal language, allusions and so on, perspectives, but at the same time brought to bear on the life of a monk that is clearly identified within the Chan tradition, which was kind of developing and becoming prominent during this time. Let me give you another example of an inscription. This is, I think I mentioned it before in passing in one of my earliest lectures. This is also a text I've, by the way, all these texts I've written about and translated in details if you're interested, you can find in my previous publication. So, Bojui, this was probably, I don't know, when was it exactly? I think around 810. So he writes inscription for this famous Chan master. At least he was famous at the time. Now he's not so famous. Later tradition kind of demotes his importance and he's kind of relegated to footnote in Chan history. But during his time, he was the major Chan master. His name is Wei Quan, and he writes this inscription. He knows him personally. So Daxing Shanse, it's still a monastery you can visit actually in Xi'an. At that time, it was a major monastery in Chang'an, the capital, the main capital of the Tang Empire, one of the two capitals, Luoyang being the secondary one. So the inscription, I have lots of information. Last time I mentioned it, I think it was in the first lecture. It was about this notion of lineage. So he describes kind of certain version of the Chan lineage. But another thing that Bojui is doing is he's relating some of his personal conversations with his Chan master. So I couldn't cram, the passage is a little bit longer. So this is the Chinese here. And then this is the translation. So basically, when Jui, so Jui writing himself, right, about his own experience with the master. So he said, when I was in, the context here is he's in Chang'an. So Wei Quan is invited to the capital to preach at the imperial court. And he's staying in this very important monastery in the capital. And then Baijui or Bojui, who is very interested in Buddhism, he has been practicing, involved with Buddhism, kind of associated with monks from early in his life. So he goes to this popular Chan master and he received instructions and then after the Chan master dies, he writes this inscription in which he incorporates these dialogues he had or discussions he had with the master. So he, when he serves an assistant to the crown prince, so he goes 4 times to speak with the master, and these are kind of records or abbreviated versions of their discussion. So the first one is this is interesting, also basically as a source of information about how you relate Chan to the rest of Buddhism. And it kind of provides a completely different, almost diametrically opposed perspective to the special transmission outside of the scriptures type of sectarian attitude that is evidenced by the poem that I introduced at the beginning of the talk. So the question, Bojo asked a question. So since you're called a Chan teacher or a Chan master, Chan She, why do you lecture on the Dharma, right? So you can ask Matsu the same thing. You're supposed to be a Chan master, and we have certain expectations, certain ideas about what Chan masters do. But you're lecturing, you're giving all these sermons about the Dharma. Why do you do that? And then Wei Quan says, when the incomparable body, Sanskrit term for awakening, is expressed by the physical body, it is the Vinaya, or the code of monastic discipline, one of the foundational elements of Buddhism. When it is expounded via the mouth, it is the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. When it is practiced via the mind, it is Chan, and here Chan have dual meaning. But here means basically meditation. So you have Vinaya, Dharma, and meditation, Dhyana in Sanskrit. But also you can read it in the context of you being a Chan master, that is to say, particular member of particular school or tradition of Chinese Buddhism. So both meanings are implied here. So there are these 3 modes of application, but in reality, they're all the same. It's like rivers and lakes that have different names. Although their names are not the same, the nature of water is identical everywhere. Vinaya is Dharma, and Dharma is not apart from Chan. How can one falsely create distinctions among them? So this is kind of very interesting perspective, which clashes with traditional understanding of Chan as being unique, different, separate, and so on. But it very much fits into the kind of more historically accurate understanding of Chan, which I and others maybe have tried to convey through our research and writing, looking more closely to the sources. So you can say this was really very much so kind of, there is a distinct Chan tradition, yes, but at the same time, it's not opposed or separated outside, but it's still very much part of this larger Buddhist tradition. So in terms of the genres, there is a tendency to lump all these texts together as kind of expounding the same truth or kind of elaborating on the same vision of the Buddhist path of practice and awakening. And this is what I refer to as the illusion of homogeneity, this kind of notion that Chan is a distinct tradition, that, you know, when contemporary Chan master who claims to have lineage transmission, I don't know, from going back to Suyun and through Suyun to, I don't know, all these other ancient masters and so on, that they kind of participants in the same tradition. That's a very problematic assertion because, as I hope I have already conveyed, and it will become even more clearer as my lectures unfold, but actually there's huge differences between Chan tradition for one period to another, especially Tang versus Sung Chan are very, very, very different. And then, of course, if you look at Zen later on as develops, either during the Kamakura period in Japan or later on, during the Meiji or contemporaries, and It's very, very, very different. Chan in Son in Korea, contemporary, this kind of fetishization of the Kanghua method and a little bit fundamentalist approach to Chan ideology is very, I mean, maybe you can relate to elements of Sung Dynasty Chan. Definitely there's a connection there, but it's also very, very different, certainly very different than the kind of texts and traditions and outlooks that, for example, I've been studying for important Tang Dynasty figure. So basically, so kind of, and one way to look at this difference is to break this notion or illusion of Chan homogeneity, that a singular tradition, that it unfolds unbroken, in part because it's anchored in this kind of lineage of patriarchs that continues supposedly to the present, is to look at how different genres develop, because the genres are really reflections, literary reflections of important paradigm shifts or important developmental trajectories, you can say, within the broader Chan tradition. So basically, the creation of distinctive genres, such as the four main ones I mentioned, and perhaps others that I didn't speak about, it's a gradual process. So you have certain discursive properties that become codified into particular literary form, and in those that are characteristic of the developing Chan tradition, we put the label of Chan genres. Now, if you look at the origins of genres, like how are genres developed? Well, what's the origins of genres? Well, genres evolve from other genres, basically. This is kind of, if you look at genre theory, Tsvetan Todorov, for example, and other theories who have looked at genre, not in the East Asian context, but more generally, mostly based on Western literature. So basically, so if you look at how these genres develop, you can look at various prototypes. You have some pan-Buddhist prototype, for example, biographies, various biographies of Buddhist monks, various sermons, for example, and so on. That existed before Chan, or maybe developed parallel to Chan, but also the non-Buddhist models of writing. The still inscription was applied as a literary form, or the convention associated with it applied to the lives and legacies of Buddhist monks generally, and more specific Chan masters. But this kind of intersected with a larger tradition of commemorative writing in China that goes back in time before the advent of China, and of course also have parallel development. Also, if you look at, for example, the records of sayings, the Yulu, I mean, if you look at the Analects of Confucius or Lunya, I mean, it's a similar idea, right? What is the Analects of Confucius? It's about bits and pieces of sayings and conversations that supposedly were articulated by Confucius. Of course, Confucius himself, like most Chan masters, especially from Tang era, didn't write anything himself, but his disciples supposedly collected some of these sayings or some of these conversations that remembered between them and their disciples, and they put it together into a collection. Of course, the history of the text is more complicated. You have later editions and so on, but basically you have a record of the sayings of Confucius, right? And also the genres are not static. So you have this kind of period of evolution. So this kind of codification of properties, literary properties. And then you have maybe a mature model of the genre. For example, Qing de Chuandenlu will be a prime example of the transmission of the Lam Chronicle genre. And you can say Linchi Yulu, for example, prime example of the records of sayings and so on. But also the genre changes. I mean, individual texts introduce new, so you have this kind of basic structure, basic format, basic style, but at the same time, the genre evolves over time. It's not something that is static or overly rigid. So, and this goes back to the individual, the convoluted origin of provenance of individual texts. All these texts I mentioned have very, very complicated histories. Important part of some of the larger texts to keep in mind is that they are not singular narratives that were created in one go. So as I've been thinking about it, I'm thinking of the concept of modularity, actually. So you have different parts that come together and you create something. So you have parts, but parts can be rearranged. This was kind of modularity idea was with phones, actually, if I can use analogy from technology. I think LG introduced before they went out of business, so you can take out the battery, for example, or the memory and rearrange and add other parts, add better camera on the phone. So you have different parts and you can kind of rearrange them in different ways. So you can think of the origins of some of the bigger text as kind of being composed by different modules or different parts. So in that sense, they're hybrid narratives and multi-layer narratives. So there's not a single text. And often you have, for example, a particular story about a particular Chan master. So you can appear in one text and then it's reproduced in another text and integrated in first text, integrated with other materials, integrated in a different narrative, but then it's also taken out and put into another text, which might belong to a completely different genre. So that's why you have lots of overlap among the genres. Maybe not so much the ones about monastic life, the rules of purity genre, it's kind of somewhat separate. But the other ones, for example, you can have a story that appears in Transmission of the Lamp Chronicle, and then when they compile the record of sayings of Master, the same story is included there, and then maybe the stories might be taken from there and put into a koan collection where it becomes a particular gongan, and then there is an exegesis, new materials kind of around it. And it's not just the stories, how they are rearranged in different texts and where they come from and so on, but also how the stories are spread, how these texts and these narratives are diffused, spread, transmitted, read, interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted, and so on. And we are going to talk about it some more later on. So kind of as usual, I'm going over time, but let me speed this up. Let me tell you a little bit about this process. So basically, you have a bunch of texts which have complicated origins, which hybrid narratives, so there are different parts kind of called together and so on. So how do you make a sense? So this is what I refer to as textual archaeology. So you kind of like an archaeologist, you dig into the text and look at the composing parts and they try to trace them where they come from at different times, different places, by different authors, and as much as you can, by of course looking at different versions of the same text or similar stories or similar sermons in other texts. So one example that I've done more extensively is to look at the record of Matsu's saying, Matsu Yulu. So this text is quite late, actually. It was composed in 11th century. That's the Northern Song era. As you might remember, Matsu died in 788. So this is almost 300 years after his passing away. Imagine, I know it's not going to happen, but just imagine if somebody were to reproduce this lecture almost 300 years after I die without the benefit of YouTube and recording and so on. So, but at the same time, so obviously you can say this is a Song Dynasty text and reflects the worldviews and the assumptions and the biases and the agendas of the compilers of this text. But at the same time, and this is a mistake that sometimes scholars, especially Western scholars of this text make, is this is not a Song Dynasty creation, because pretty much everything that is included in this text can be found in earlier records. So these people, writers, monks, editors from the Song Dynasty, they didn't create a new text. I mean, they're active participants. They created the text, but the content that go there, basically they use cut and paste, what we can refer to as cut and paste techniques. So they get various sources from before and they put them together into coherent narratives, and then you have a new text. So, and all these sources, or these modules, you can say, have diverse origins, and they have different histories of textual transmission. You can see some of the stories. I've done some research, others have done. You can see how they change over time. What might be a simple story with one meaning become more elaborate by addition to other materials, and maybe assume different meaning, or more complicated story is simplified, but also kind of then it's kind of moves into completely different interpretive direction. And it all reflects the perceptions, the agendas, the attitudes, the concerns of the people who are putting these stories, transmitting them, changing them, adapting them, and so on. So we have one text, right? And this is this was actually my first book. This was 30 years ago. I was in my 20s at that time. So so this was, I translated this text when I was quite young. And so you have one text, but you have various voices. You have the voice of Matsu, and we should not forget the voice of Matsu is there, but you also have voice of later transmitters, editors, compilers, and so on. And if you look at the text, so when Sung Dynasty monks or writers try to create an image of Matsu, I mean, of course, they go back to the sources, but they are driven by their own understanding of what Chan masters such as Matsu should be, just as if contemporary person without knowledge of the history and kind of all this kind of stuff that I'm trying to communicate through this lecture goes and look at the text, we will interpret ancient teachers and teachings in terms of our own understanding, in terms of our own worldview, in terms of our own assumptions, biases, concerns, agendas, and so on. And this is what is happening in contemporary Buddhism. This is kind of, in a way, inevitable. But we can also be a little bit more careful, and maybe we can do our homework and try to understand tradition in more greater detail and depth. And I hope this is what lectures and writings of this kind can help, not just in academic context, but also people who are part of the tradition to look at their tradition in a bit with in a little bit more detail, with a little bit more historical nuance and understanding. Knowledge never hurts if you want to know, and especially if you're invested in certain tradition, if you engage seriously, perhaps you should try to learn something about it. Anyway, so you have this kind of rearrangement of materials, but also exclusions. For example, there's certain stories you find in later texts that are not included in Matsu-Yolo. So why did they exclude? Maybe they didn't have them, but maybe it didn't fit into their notion of what a Chan master such as Matsu should be like. So I've written about this. I'm going to go very, very briefly, but basically, if you look at the text of Matsu, it's supposed to be a singular narrative, but actually you can divide it into different parts, more specifically 3 main parts. The first one is Biographical Sketch, which is along the lines of the still inscriptions. So Matsu was born here and there. He studied with such and such teacher. And so kind of some of it is based on the still inscription, some of other sources, including another inscriptions that was lost and so on. So this is pretty straightforward. And then you have transcript of 3 of his sermons. And here Matsu, basically the image of Matsu, Matsu's religious persona is that of a very learned, articulate teaching. I gave you this passage earlier, right? So he can quote scripture, he have mastery, he can rearrange, he can inspire people, he can deliver these beautiful sermons that supposedly go at the core of Buddhist teaching and illuminate Chan path to illumination and transcendence and so on. And then the third part, 32 short exchanges, or what in scholarly literature often we refer to as encounter dialogues between him and his disciple. And here we have Matsu as an iconoclast. Here we have shoutings, beatings. He says certain strange things and so on. So, and this is kind of the image, the more popular image we have of Chan masters as iconoclasts, which is also what attracted Western audiences to Chan or Zen through the writings of Zungmi and so on. So this is a countercultural hero who is challenging conventions and kind of doesn't care about rules and precepts and is kind of doing this. So I gave you some examples of sermons from Matsu. This is kind of to give you an example from the kind of to break the monotony and to introduce some other voices. A sermon by Huang Po, which is kind of similar in its basic outlook. So So basically, you have a Chan giving a very articulate sermon, which, yeah, it's kind of Chan point of view, but also can be understood within the larger doctrinal, theoretical, but also soteriological templates of Tang Buddhism as understood among the monastic and the cultural elites. So there is not a single thing. Far here, you can say also teaching, the thing or teaching, depending on the different interpretation, not a single practice to cultivate. That's the supreme way. So this is kind of very lofty, abstract conception of the highest reaches of Buddhist spirituality. And that's the true Buddha. And so he goes on to say that you should not worry to giving rise to a single thought, because when you give rise to a single discriminating thought, you separate yourself from the Tao, from the way. And then when no signs, no activity, that's the Buddha. If you wish to attain Buddhahood, you should need a study of Buddhist teaching. You need not study all Buddhist teaching. You should not seek and not become attachment, transcend all afflictions, and then there is nothing to be. And this is typical kind of ideas you find in the sermons of Huang Po and others. But in the stories about Matsu, these are actual stories from Matsu's record. You have a different vision of Matsu. The first one features this question about Bodhidharma, and this is very formulaic question, Sila Yi, the meaning of the coming from the West. So first, why did Bodhidharma come to Chan? And by extension, what's the essence of Chan? So there's somebody comes to Matsu asking this question, which actually appears, this is a Sung dynasty, nothing to do with Matsu historically speaking. This is a phrase that kind of is featured in Sung dynasty text. Well, you can find echoes of that in Tang dynasty, but the story itself is basically, so monk comes, asks this formulaic question, which is supposed to be some kind of direct request for insight, for revealing insight about the ultimate nature of reality. And Matsu said, hits him, and he says, if I don't hit you, people everywhere will laugh at me. So what's the meaning of this? And then the second story, I have to just leave for a moment. I apologize for that. I'm sorry. I know it's rude, but it was unavoidable. All right. So the second is very, very briefly, it's about Pang Yun, the layman, and I'm going to talk about him later on in more detail. So Pang Yun, the layman, comes to Matsu and asks, the unveiled original man, the original face, you can say, Van Lai Mi and Mu, ask you to look upward, please. And then, so he asks, look upward, and Matsu looks down. And then he says, oh, only you can play so wonderfully on a stringless lute. So some kind of obscure reference, like you're unique or whatever. And then Matsu, in response, Matsu looks down. And then Pang Yun bows down, and then Matsu goes to his quarters, you can say to the Pangchan, to the output room. And then the layman follows him. And then when he enters the room, he says, just now, Bengali trying to be smart. So what's the meaning of this? I mean, if you have to, you can come up with some kind of interpretation or meaning. So why did Matsu have to beat? Like, what is it? Is it some kind of manifestation? I'm going to talk about interpretation later on, and you can find some of the early books on Chan. There was this layman from Hong Kong, actually, Charles Luke. He wrote early on. This was pioneering and wonderful contribution to the popularization of Chan teaching. So he did lots of translation, but he felt compelled to translate everything. So we'll come up with these completely fanciful translations of this kind of encounters, which kind of, what on earth is this? But so you can do that if you want, if you need to. When I did my first book, again, I was in my 20s. I was a Buddhist monk at that time, and I approached this publisher. This was Asian Humanities Press. And so kind of gave them a manuscript. So they said, okay, we are going to publish it. It's good stuff. But they said, you know, for our audience, it will be helpful. This story is so strange. We don't know what it means. So maybe it will be helpful to explain what it means. My response was, I have no idea what it means. I mean, what does it mean? Look up, look down. I mean, you can say it's manifestation of great function. He's manifesting himself, but that's kind of really fanciful imagination. I mean, the story could be or could be just some kind of, I don't know, nonsense. I mean, I hit you and I say, if I don't hit you, people will laugh at me. I mean, there are all kinds of possible interpretations, so I can interpret them, but it's kind of, so I said, I really don't want to come up with this kind of, maybe I can explain certain things that I explain them, but other things like, do we really need to explain it, right? So this brings back to this kind of larger issue. I mean, you have these different images of Matsu even within one text. So you have the biography of the monk and his life and so on, but you have this kind of learned master who is coming up with this kind of inspiring sermons about the nature of mind and reality, engaging in a rational discourse about the stages of practice, some of the pitfalls of attachments and so on. And then you have this guy who is kicking people and saying strange things and so on. So how do we reconcile these different images of Matsu in terms of kind of here autobiographical element here? So I encountered this text first time. These were some of the earlier texts I read. I taught myself Chinese when I was living in Hong Kong. I was like started when I was 18, 19 years old, living in a monastery at Lantau Island. And I taught myself classical Chinese because I wanted to read these texts and also some of the Buddhist scriptures. And then I really loved these kind of records of Chan masters, especially Matsu, Baijian, Pangpo, and so on. So I would read this kind of stuff, but then I would come up with these kind of sermons that I found that were very beautiful, inspiring, edifying, maybe good. Since I was a monk, I was trying to practice. I also used them as a model of spiritual cultivation. And then there were these kind of stories which are like, wow, what's this? So what do you do? But at the same time, this is all Matsu, right? It's the enlightened master. Or like the Bible, the New Testament, you have, or the Quran, even more so. You have some kind of stuff that is very inspiring, you know, kind of it's about love and brotherhood, helping the poor, and then some stuff that, it's this kind of apocalyptic visions or the image of God that's some nasty person who, if you piss him off, you know, can send you plague and kill you and burn you, or anti-Semitic kind of tropes and this and that. So how do you reconcile all these interpretations? So personally, when I was young, I really didn't try to reconcile. I didn't know about the origins of the text. I assumed this is all record of Matsu's. The parts that I found meaningful, I just followed and read and studied and recited and to try to practice. And the parts that I found meaningless, which is most of these encounter dialogue stories, I just ignored. And this is a very common attitude among religious people, where kind of you either interpret certain parts that might be difficult, weird, maybe move into unethical norms and so on, by interpreting them in fanciful ways. So if you have in biblical exegesis quite a bit, but also in Buddhist exegesis, unfortunately, we have some passages that are really problematic, and you try to interpret them in terms of higher meanings, like, well, God did something nasty. He asked this guy to sacrifice his only son, but it was not that nasty, you know. You have some kind of interpretation about this and that, or why did he did some nasty people, kill people and so on. So what was behind the larger, or you can just ignore them, like, you know, it's if you try to live biblically, I mean, it's very difficult in Buddhism. If you take everything literally, try to follow all the precepts, you know, I mean, it's kind of, some of it is harsh, killing heretics and kind of punishing people for moral transgression in very extreme ways and so on. So we are running out of time, but basically, so in terms of my concluding remarks here, I would say, so some of the things to consider is this kind of relationship between Chan and Buddhism, to also understand the proliferation of texts within Chan, and that kind of also to relate it to this kind of artificial notion of Chan having nothing to do with Chan. Text is just about experience of enlightenment and so on. Also to understand how those texts are composed, the different genres they were composed, that they're convoluted histories of textual production, transmission. So it's all kind of, I know it might look a little bit daunting, a little bit confusing. So maybe this didn't bring clarity, kind of brought you all these kind of different issues and so on. But to look at it from a different perspective, lots of stuff there to read. So plenty of opportunities to read, to study, to reflect. If you have skills, there are lots of texts you can translate. You can do that in an academic sense, as I'm doing right now. You can do it in a different way as a practitioner, try to find some kind of meaning or inspiration of these texts. So I think I wanted to end on a poem, but hey, let's leave that from next time. So I'm sorry, I'm not very good with my time. I don't know if I don't think there are too many questions. I think there are maybe 4 or 5. Should we end now, or is there some questions I should address?
There are, Professor, there are 3 questions on chat. I think you can clearly identify them. 9:38 p.m. And
well, this is a long one. Thank you for your lecture. What do you think? Do you think that so it's about whether this distinctiveness of Chan as Jiao Bia Chuan, special transmission outside of the scripture, is something that lay followers, literati during the Tang, acknowledge the distinctiveness when literati such as Bojui use the character Chan, like Chan poem, did they particularly mean Chan tradition or more generally Buddhism? Both. I mean, definitely there was a distinction. This kind of notion kind of still kind of circulating Western academia that there was no real Chan tradition that Chan really took during the Sung. It's really, I'm sorry to say, but complete nonsense. And I cannot believe that it's still circulating in scholarly articles. But at the same time, of course, what do we mean? Chan was not the same in the sense of like sectarian Zen, like you have Lynch Zen in contemporary Japan or something like that. Obviously, it didn't exist in that sense, but there was awareness. So, but definitely there was awareness. I mean, Bojui wrote about the lineages and transmissions and so on, and so on. So you have both meanings are implied, but the distinctions are not very clear. For example, if you look at the religious identity of Bojui, and I'm going to talk about it later on. So definitely he was close to certain Chan monks, Wei Quan being one of them, Ruman with another one, and I'm going to give you more detail maybe if you're interested later on. So definitely there was this kind of affinity, and definitely he recognized Chan as a distinct tradition, but at the same time also Chan as a meditation practice. So both meanings can be understood and implied, and they're not mutually exclusive. So the notion of Jiao Bia Chuan, that's a Sung dynasty contract. So this kind of distinction between Chan and Buddhism and the rest of Buddhism that we sometimes ascribe to Tang Chan didn't quite operate. So the distinction was not that clear. So yes, there was a distinct group, but at the same time, they were very much part of a large tradition. And this passage of this conversation between Wei Quan and Bojui that I cited earlier in the talk today kind of points to that. So he says, yeah, Chancha, and here he means both, yeah, meditation master, but also part of this unique tradition. But this kind of extreme sectarian notion of that is conveyed by Jiao Bia Chuan saying the separate transmission, it's not, that's more of a Sung dynasty construct, definitely. And also, so Baizhui, he would be interested in Chan, but he's also interested in other Buddhist traditions. He's also interested in Taoist texts. He's also educated in the Confucian classic, and that's part of his intellectual but also religious outlook and so on. So these kind of identities are not as rigid, not as reified, and they're also overlapping. So that's a short, kind of short explanation.
Yeah, there is another 2 questions before that. I don't know whether you would like to answer them now.
I have two questions related to Chan text. Articulate Chan is not about the Buddha. Chan text seems to have no interest in the image of the Buddha, and then why great monastics in China all have elaborate Buddha halls and Buddha statues and so on. So, yeah, so it's a kind of, again, goes back to this idea that China is very much part of the larger Buddhist tradition. So when I talk about, like Lynch says, kill the Buddha, he's not, I mean, it's kind of can be read as an iconoclastic sense, but what he's saying is, and again, keep in mind the audience, which I think is why perhaps you might want to come for the lecture next time, where I deal with the monastic context and the monastic ideals, but basically, to understand China, you have to understand within this monastic context in which monks go and recite scriptures in front of the Buddha and perform rituals and so on. And then in terms of the records we have, we say, okay, you do all these kind of things, but you shouldn't fetishize the Buddha. You shouldn't attach to the Buddha or to your idea or to your conception of the Buddha. So if you have some idea of what the Buddha is, or if you think you're a Buddha, you have to kill that, because as long as you are attached to this notion, to this idea, you cannot progress. This is not mutually exclusive. You have to understand this context in which worship of a Buddha and Buddha image and the main hall and so on is. But definitely, there is a shift away from reliance of kind of focus on the Buddha as a historical person to more focus on Buddhahood as a general category of experience, or maybe philosophical category that points to the nature of reality and so on. But these different layers of everyday life and temple worship and placement of Buddha images at the halls, and then this very verified rhetoric which kind of deflects from this aspect and reinterprets Buddhism in different ways. They're not mutually exclusive. Actually, you have to understand this on-the-ground context of monastic life, which in many ways is very, very traditional, notwithstanding all these stories about eccentric behaviors and iconoclastic acts. Really, on the whole, Chan is fairly conservative tradition, which creates new paradigms, new ideals, new images, new idioms, but it's very much also grounded in traditions of Buddhist monasticism, in which worship of the Buddha and remembrance of the legacy of the Buddha is very much a part. I think this, and then what, should I go on, or kind of really?
Maybe now, since time is up, maybe next time when you're making your presentation, you can combine some.
About Gongan, and maybe you can bring it on. So apology, there's another question about the Gongan, so we can talk. Actually, maybe bring it together, because I'm going to have a whole lectures on Gongan.
Okay.
So again, sorry for my poor timekeeping.
No, it's very okay. No problem.
I hope it was helpful in terms of clarifying certain issues and kind of bringing certain text to the fore and so on. And thank you for moderating this, and for those of you who are still.
Thank you, Professor Poceski, for this insightful your lectures and lecture series. And for the audience, I think I would like to mention that next lecture, lecture 6, will take place on June 30th, Thursday. So not next 2 weeks, but June 30th. So please join us on the topic monastic ideals and the pure rules for Chan monasteries. So thank you very much, Professor, and thank you everyone who joined today for this lecture series and today's lecture. And please join us again. So thank you, everyone. So good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.